Hello, everybody. I'm here with a dear friend, John Cerullo. He's a book publisher as his profession for over 40 years. He's been publishing books on music, theater, film, other performing arts. He also published books on Buddhism and yoga. He's developed many professional development online courseware training programs to help both students and professionals advance their careers. John regularly teaches on Buddhist principles and practices, all having the aim to benefit others. His teachings are crafted to present topics in an accessible manner, directly relating to people's suffering and revealing methods people can use to meet their everyday challenges. He also hosts weekly guided meditations, again, in a manner that is crafted to relate to people where they live. John has studied and practiced Buddhism for over 40 years, including Zen Buddhism with Philip Kapleau and Tibetan Buddhism with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Sakya Trijan, and currently with Khensa Rinpoche Losang Jampa and Geshe Losang Dargye. Additionally, he holds certification in the Asian Classics Institute's 18 Foundation course series, which is a 7-year formal study program that parallels the same core information taught in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. John also has in-depth formal training in yoga texts, including Master Pantajali's Yoga Sutras and Yogis Ramas. Am I saying that correct, John?
Yes.
Hatha yoga practice. So, John, welcome, and I'm so grateful that you're taking the time to share your experience with us.
Happy to be here.
Thanks. My first question for you is, what influences in your life led you to developing your compassion and living a compassionate life?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Mostly simple life experiences that really opened me up to, this might sound a little strange, but knowing pain and suffering in both an internal sense of feelings and emotions, and also as witnessing them in the external world. And these really started as little daily occurrences in my normal everyday life, and started in my youth. So, an example of that would be when we were kids, we used to go down to the local corner store. It was a candy store. We would call it a convenience store nowadays. And I was with a friend this particular day named Paulie, and Paulie didn't have any money to buy any candy. So I was like, okay, but quickly he became extremely unhappy. So much so that he was planning to steal some candy. He had to have it. I was struck by the intense desire that overcame him over this small matter of like having to have right at that moment that piece of candy. Everything went out the window. It was a good kid, all of his ethics about not stealing, whatever his parents taught him, etc. So I was like, here, take my money and buy some candy. So he did take it, and he was a nice kid. He took it and he was appreciative. I was probably about 10 years old when that happened. But these kinds of small events, just witnessing the overwhelming, irrational, emotional, visceral response to like grasping on to such a simple thing that we all have to varying degrees and take shapes in varying ways, even as we're young. And actually, as we're young, from the moment we're born, that happens. What are we grasping onto? What are we pushing away? Another example of that was in our neighborhood growing up. We had a neighborhood bully, like a lot of people did. And we had one who lived right next door to me. His name was Craig. And he was about 3 years older than most of us kids in the neighborhood. But he was always a problem for the neighborhood. When he was around, there was this pervasive fear that something bad was going to happen, and it was going to come from him. It might be the kids playing a game of kickball, and he would all of a sudden, like chaotically, run into the middle of the game, grab the ball, and throw it at somebody's head. And one day, when one of these events was happening, his father came home and saw, sort of the tail end of one of these events. Well, his father took him to task in front of everyone. He verbally assaulted him, abused him, mocked him intensely, repeatedly. And I remember one expression he called them little Craigie doll. You're a little Craigie doll, like a little crybaby. And I saw this powerful kid bully just wither, physically shrink, and emotionally, you could see that he was being beat to a pulp emotionally. I just had to take that painful experience. I didn't know what to do with it. I was a pretty sensitive kid. I ran into my house, closed my door, and I just cried for him. And I cried specifically because I didn't know what I could do for him. What could I do for him? How could I actually help him, like with the pain that he was obviously feeling? I didn't have a clue, but I felt this natural need to like do something. And these are the kind of things I want to share with you that we all have just in our normal everyday course of living, that really bring that kind of experience home to our heart, especially when we're young and we're open and we don't have a lot of filters yet to sort of start blocking these things out that are flying around in our moment by moment experience on a constant basis. That kind of really expanded more when I was in grammar school. The Catholic school I went to, the nuns had a program, an after school program where kids could volunteer to go spend some time with truly very underprivileged families in a neighboring city. The city was Paterson. I grew up in New Jersey, and this was a city called Paterson. Really, really challenging place to raise a family. So I volunteered, and I can remember the first time I went, I could still smell it. It was so visceral. This going into this walk-up tinder box of a building that felt like it was going to fall over at any second. I'm not even exaggerating. One room apartment, that means 3 rooms, a bedroom, kitchen, and kind of an entranceway. So really 2.5 rooms, maybe. 5 adults, 6 children living there. The smell, the crowded confines, the lack of privacy for all, the pervasive feeling in the air of various kinds of emotions, sadness, pain, envy, gratitude, love, hatred, jealousy. I was overwhelmed. And we usually took these kids to a park or ice cream parlor for a few hours, and the kids were 8 to 12. And their life experiences were so challenging every moment of the day. In most cases, I experienced these kids as not even being children any longer. They were numb and or had like already moved to like fighting their way into adult behavior and emotional patterns of response that would allow them to protect themselves. Because what else did they have? They didn't know any better. So again, I had these questions in my mind of like, what could one really do for people like this? And more importantly, like what causes these kinds of sufferings? What can one do about these kinds of sufferings? And as I got older, to answer your question maybe a little bit more directly, some of my influences in pursuing my wanting to find answers like that first started with my own faith. I was raised a Catholic. Although I experienced kindness and compassion, like in the example I just gave you, these were very much like do something for the moment. Nothing wrong with that. But not really addressing cause and what is really going on in life. So, it started my journey. I went through, in my teen years, I started exploring all kinds of religious and spiritual paths. I eventually circled back to Catholicism in a contemplative space. My first real influence was Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, I first read his memoir, Seven Story Mountain. And then I was really mostly moved by his contemplative writings, especially those that connected with Eastern practices like Buddhism, especially Zen. And as an 18-year-old, I left high school, and before I went to college, I moved to Gethsemane, Kentucky, which was where the Abbey of Gethsemane was, where he lived. He had passed away. This was the early 70s. He died in a tragic accident going over to Thailand for a Buddhist interfaith conference, actually. But I thought I wanted to be a Trappist monk. That would be the answer. I lived there for 6 months and met with his former abbot, Abbot Fox, and he basically said, "You don't belong here. You need to get into the world. That's where you belong. You're not a contemplative. That's okay for some people, but not for you." And so I continued my journey. And, from there, I really got involved in my 20s in Zen Buddhist practice. That's where I worked with Roshi Philip Kaplow, an American Roshi. And that was my first real connection with meditative practices that brought some knowledge and wisdom to my heart, but not so much my consciousness. So eventually, Zen Buddhism and I, hopefully people can see this, we kind of did this. We kind of just went right past each other. I have my hands going past each other. So, this is kind of like where the motivation for me to engage in a compassionate life started. Personal, small experiences that happened in every moment. And then trying to formalize that in some way, all while I was developing a professional endeavor as a publishing professional in the music business, which was sort of a parallel reality, which eventually came together. But that kind of answers, I think, tells you what I wanted to speak to and to your first question.
Beautiful. I felt so much connection as you were talking because I had a aggressive older brother that paralleled the bully in your neighborhood. And as a social worker, I've seen so many times where abject poverty and or somebody who's psychologically troubled and inflicting pain on themselves and everybody around them creates so much pain. And like you, finding sanity amidst the chaos of the world and people to guide me towards compassion. What have you found as you've tried to live a life of compassion? What have you found the benefits are and the drawbacks as you've pursued this course?
Yeah, I would say because of the specific road I ended up on, the path, I use that word a lot, that I ended up on, there was one benefit. I could probably articulate and separate that into lots of examples, but the one singular benefit is if one can find a place in one's heart whereby your motivation and intent in doing any kind of compassionate activity is really for the benefit of others and not to bolster one's own feelings of importance or anything sort of along those lines. Like, look at me, look what I'm doing for others. Isn't that great? It's like, then what happens? This is an experience. It's not like a, mental, conceptual thing. It arises, the experience of happiness. So the benefit is happiness, what I call real happiness, happiness found and experienced in seeing others find real and lasting happiness and knowing that I was part of that or I am part of that in terms of practicing, like in an engaged, active way, compassionate activities in the world. And that's how that happens. For me, it's all about anchoring your activities of compassion and engagement in that wisdom that one can find, which we'll talk a little bit about during this interview, that wisdom about how a life really works. Those answers I wanted when I was a kid, like, why is this happening? What is happening? And can you really help someone? Is there something you can really do? Is there a path, so to speak, that can lead someone to true happiness, not just temporary one, like, which I witnessed and was part of when I was a youth as well. That's the whole shooting match. That's the benefit. That's the only benefit I looked to first sort of aspirationally experience, but then eventually you can actually experience that. It's happiness, and the happiness is found in giving and bringing to others happiness. And as far as drawbacks go, I would say that the particular road I traveled, and I have been traveling, is once one finds kind of a knowledge of like how things really work. In other words, like the nature of existence. And in Buddhism, which is a path that I follow, it's present in the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, that suffering, quality of existence, and this is something that one can become aware of, that as one then starts on that path, one can have, I'm going to talk about sort of inner drawbacks. It causes like lots of challenges, fears, insecurities, not only with oneself, but then when one goes to engage in specific compassionate activities, like, are you really in a position where you really can help people? You have this knowledge, but like, and my daughter, who changed her career like in midstream, she used to be in the publishing business, and then she studied to become a software engineer. They used to teach them in coding school about imposter syndrome. Are you really a software engineer, or are you really just somebody saying you're a software? So same thing for me when I started teaching courses based on this wisdom of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths specifically, and then trying to put that into a more relatable format, which you mentioned when you were reading about my biography. You're sort of going into motivated by an inner feeling of really wanting to help people, share this knowledge with them, but you want to connect with them. You try to do it in a way that goes to where they live in their daily life. You're not trying to replicate, if you will, what true masters teach, like in the Buddhist tradition. I don't want to. I don't think I'm even capable of teaching courses the way my teachers teach them. Geshe Dargye and Khenpo Rinpoche from my Buddhist center in Connecticut called DNKL. That's for them, not for. So as I try to take what I've learned from them and with their blessing, go out and try to pioneer sort of a new way for, it's really the drawback is confronting your, maybe it's the wrong word, drawback, but this is what I came up with. It's like, it's tackling your own fears and insecurities about your approach. Will it even work? Will it truly even benefit people? So facing those insecurities and fears are something that have been life-altering, but at the same time, I didn't realize that was going to be in the cards for me, So you have to have courage, when you go down this road. But if you have the right motivation and intent, it overwhelms those fears and insecurities, So maybe enough said.
Well, I love how you put that, where to begin with, you have to kind of check your mind to see, okay, am I doing this for me? or am I sincerely in a zone where I can think of this other person and what they need? Because as a social worker, I have to do that all the time. And I really related when you were saying like imposter syndrome, like who am I to do this? My first 2 years out of social work school, I was like, why are they telling me all this? And what can I do? And that sense of kind of helplessness in the face of suffering. Um, a lot of professionals feel that in the helping field, and it's that helplessness that can lead to burnout and compassion fatigue and all that stuff. And so
Yeah,
I and the way you're dealing with it in terms of bolstering your confidence and going forward in the face of that is really wonderful. And the benefits of true happiness too. So, what are some of the actual projects you've worked on? And
sure. Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd like to relate to people who might watch this or listen to this, interview is that you don't have to have like a big object, meaning like a program or a project. So when you use the word project, it can be big. Nothing wrong with that, and it can reach a lot of people. But I hate for people to miss the opportunity to pursue engaged compassion right in front of them. So, really the form and shape of my endeavors have been really varied, and they take into they've come into the flow of my life from the point of view of like labels that are attached to me, and rightfully so because of my experience and what I've gained in terms of knowledge and relationships, etc., in the publishing business and in the Dharma world, if you will. So over the years, I've learned how to apply that in these varying ways. So for me, first at home, recently my immediate family went through the loss of our father. He passed away a couple of years ago, and that created a lot of suffering for them. And so I decided to give them, in a formal way, some written meditations that really kind of gave in-depth observations on death, the process, and how someone, in this case, for all of us, our father, because this was directed to my family, my sisters, my brother, and others, nieces, nephews, my own children, the loss and how our dad, granddad could still be present to all of us on a daily basis in a dynamic and really helpful way that actually wasn't possible when he was actually still here. It is and it's right there. It's right around the corner. So they were very grateful, many of my family members, and that led to them asking me if I would actually kind of do some kind of a weekly meditation session with all of them, which I never expected. So that became a project. I meet with my family members. It varies each week, depending on people's availability, every Tuesday evening for 20 to 30 minutes. And we don't spend time chit-chatting. We go right into a meditation. And what's interesting, what's evolved in that is fluidity, meeting my family members where they are. So a simple example is there's a few people who come, sometimes don't come other times. And I found out through feedback that some of their hesitation had to do with the fact that they're just not comfortable meditating, sitting quiet, meditate, even guided meditation. Too much noise for them going on, which is something I then work on with specific meditations each week to try to help them, almost like a trainer in a gym. But then also, a few of these people really love nature and hiking and such. So I crafted a handful of meditations that were specifically about that. As you know, you can use any object for meditation. And that opened them up to like letting the meditation be available to them because I was meeting them where they were in their interest and their enthusiasm, and it's something that really made them happy. So like that's one example of a project that I've been doing. And, that kind of fluidity is something I actually learned from my father. I was a devout Catholic, and he used to say that this was what he learned later in life. He called it listening to God, meaning that you don't just do what you want to do. You want to listen to what others need. And he called that, when you develop that ability, he had a label for it. He called it the grace of God. And, my dad taught me a lot in terms of that. I think it's made me a better engaged, member of society in terms of compassionate, practice with other people. So, another example of a project I've done is like in my professional life. I developed a few years ago, I became aware in our town of our music program being in great jeopardy. They didn't have enough money for instruments. They didn't have enough money for music. So I developed a specific auction program, one that used my relationships in the music business. I leveraged the message of like, you can do something very impactful and lasting in young people's lives. And I came up with some examples of music programs in schools literally saving kids' lives, which weren't made up. They were true. By the way, a couple of them are my own kids. So I got this amazing response. All I asked was that this celebrity person sign a copy of one of their books that my company published. So I had everybody. There were industry partners, Universal Music, Disney, Sony, etc., and all their writers. Paul McCartney, Elton John, Billy Joel, Barry Manilow, Rod Stewart, a lot of iconic pop musicians. And my company donated all the music that was needed for the program. And it's funny because, Wilson, this program that I did, it was so simple, but it turned on a light with all of my collegial partners, like these publishing companies. And over the last number of years, they've used the same model for similar altruistic, charitable missions that they wanted to, sort of lead the way on, and doing the exact same kind of an auction. And so this includes Universal, Disney, Sony, and Warner Music. All of them have done this over years. Some of them do them manually. So that's another example. And then the most recent one, real quick, is that I've been doing a series of teachings. Usually I introduce one each year. Over the last 3 years, I've been doing these courses that try to take compassionate, informed wisdom, how life really works kind of themes, and present them in an accessible way to people where it reaches them in their life, where I'm always got right in the front of my mind the person sitting in this course going, yeah, that sounds interesting, but how could I use that in my daily life? So these courses are like built around that, and they're in depth. They're usually like 8 sessions, 2 hours long. So it's like a mini, a college course, if you will. So the 3 courses I've done so far, and I'll be introducing another one in a few months. First one was called Wake Up Now, Transforming Our Lives Through the Buddha's Wheel of Life. So it was connected to Buddha's teaching, but you'd be surprised if you listen to the course, how much it doesn't go there in a strict sense of being a Buddhist teaching. And then the second one in that series called I, Me, Mine, which is actually a song by George Harrison, the famous Beatle. And the subtitle is called Using Ancient Wisdom to Discover How We Mistakenly Experience Ourselves in the World, and in the process, how to find real and lasting happiness. It's a long subtitle, but it worked. I mean, I've gotten lots of people come in for that course. And the last one tackled like a sort of our fascination, the most recent one, it's not the last one, with science. So it's called Entanglement, Emptiness, and Enlightenment. I call it the 3 E's. Entanglement is a concept in quantum physics and mechanics. The subtitle of that course is Discovering Ultimate Compassion and Interconnectedness of All Things. That's really sexy, I mean, wow. So, I've taught all these under the auspices of my local Dharma center that I'm a member of in Connecticut, DNKL. And these courses have now been picked up. They're gaining momentum, where I've been asked to teach these courses all over the world. I'm teaching one of these courses in Philadelphia starting next month, another one in London next March, and a few on Zoom where I can't travel, it's too much, So that kind of moves from like I moved through three examples for you. One that was really personal, connected to my family. That's a project. And then one connected to my professional life, and then one connected to my passionate pursuit and practice of Buddhist studies and practice. So, again, I underscore that people need to look right under their nose. They'll find an opportunity to do engaged, compassionate activity. It's right there. It's like my dad said, though, you have to listen, and then you'll find it. So, enough said.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love it. And I didn't know you were doing all that. So I'm so glad I asked the question. Sounds wonderful. So my next question is, do you ever feel defeated? And if or when those time comes, how do you reboot and how do you go forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, because when one takes on engaged, compassionate activities in the world, you're constantly interacting with people in different contexts. And sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. Some people react well to what you're doing. Sometimes they're like, what are you doing? Especially when I'm trying to present, ancient classic teachings in a sort of a contemporary framework. And most important, one can feel defeated when you're actually working with someone, whether it's in a meditation class or you're doing some one-on-one follow-up with people who've taken your course, which I do a lot of that too, by the way. And you feel like you're not connecting. And you also feel like maybe they're not benefiting from it, and that imposter syndrome slips in a little bit again too. And that's where one has to, when one gets that sense of like, maybe you could label it defeat, one needs to really be gentle with yourself. Don't have too many expectations about success in the endeavor, that engaged activity. You're human. All the people you're dealing with are human. We all have the same emotional pool of things going on moment by moment that maybe get in the way and become obstacles. And that so the first thing that I work on is being gentle and kind to myself. I guess you'd call it self-compassion or loving kindness for self. And, there's certain meditation practices for that, both in mindfulness meditation and also like in Buddhism. But what I do when I also get that way is that I find that doing meditation practices that are rooted in what really brings forth internally, so to speak, that natural, not only desire, but like need to be compassionate outwardly, to go back to those practices. And in Buddhism, I can say there are specific meditation practices that are built for that. When you finish the meditation, you're jumping out of your seat, like you have to go do this. And damn being defeated and damn having obstacles, it's okay. You have to make sure your motivation and intent, again, I mentioned this way early on in our conversation here, is anchored in looking out in that activity that one's engaging in for the benefit of others and not for one's self-interest in some sort of, odd or even perverse way or unhealthy way. It's one thing I always learned from especially Gyalme Khenso Rinpoche, one of my main teachers. It's a tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, which is what he practices, that when you teach, like you remind everyone at the teaching that why are you here? It has to be with this motivation. You can't be here just for yourself. And he's a witness to like that himself. You could tell he's not there for himself. I'm so blessed to have that inspiration. So when I'm defeated, recalling my guru, if you will, my Lama, Gyalme Khenso Rinpoche, just his presence, how he teaches, that transmits all over again, comes right to my heart, that you're using that as your motivation to benefit others for all that they've done for you. It just steamrolls feeling defeated. It re-energizes you. It brings you back to a sense of balance and purpose and focus. So these are things that one has to be okay with. So you first be gentle with yourself. There's nothing wrong with feeling defeated. And then at the same time, do something about it. Go back to your practices. If you don't have them, maybe seek out someone who you think might be able to give you something you could work with. A firm believer, which I've learned through Buddhist practice, that contemplative practices, it goes all the way back to Merton too, even. Contemplative practices, working on the inside, is the key for sort of where everything can come from. When you do, I'll use the word export it to the world that you're engaged with, whether it's at work, family, working professionally like you do in very, very many challenging situations, or you decide to take on, like I have, to become like a teacher. But I'm lucky. I have the backing of my teachers who are just amazing. I asked their permission when I first started teaching. Hey, I want to do this. What do you think? And Rinpoche's response was, well, what took you so long? So, these things help, and I feel blessed in that way. But there are things you can do if one is feeling that way, and you don't have necessarily access to the same resources I do. So then I mentioned some of them there, right?
That's absolutely beautiful. And one of the, of course, this is what Compass is about, is giving tools so that you can reboot and strengthen what's already there or develop something new within yourself. But one of the shortcomings in Compass is that it doesn't begin where Buddhist practice begins, with that relationship with somebody who embodies the qualities you're looking for, and I know the same teacher, of course. He's a teacher for me too, and you can't help but cheer up when you're around him because he's just exuding well-being and goodness and love and compassion. Um, so so you kind of answered my next question, which is, what energies inside you do you try to cultivate and tap into? But it brings me to the second to last big question, which is watching society and where society is and where it's heading. Um, how important do you think it is for more people to become aware and develop the capacity for compassion and engage compassion? How
Yeah.
important is it for global survival, do you think?
Well, in my view, and sort of just to tail end the last question and roll into this really important question you're asking, I think for me, and it goes all the way back to when I was a youth and some of those experiences I shared with you earlier in the interview, there are, for some of us, and I think ultimately for all of us, we just have to find it and not be afraid to ask the question, why is the world the way it is? Like, so when I had those experiences with my friend Paulie at the candy store, or Craig, the neighborhood bully, I wanted to know why. What causes suffering? Why is he suffering? And then, is there a way? We call it a path. I mean, that's one of my favorite words, to ending it. Wow. If there is, learn about it, study about it. And in the Buddhist world, and it's not exclusive to the Buddhist world, it happens to be my world of practice. There are tools, like you mentioned, tools that Compass embodies. There are tools that are built. There's a whole treasure chest of meditative practices for specific usages. You mentioned earlier when we were talking before the interview about Lojong practices and mind training practices, and so many that are beneficial. So I'm blessed to feel that I have some view into like what the reality of our existence is. Again, it's embodied in the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering, but then the Buddha doesn't end there. He tells us like, well, where is it coming from? And then there is a path you can take to end that suffering. Wow. And then there's actually a cessation or an end to it. So with that in mind, to your question, there's nothing more important, in my view, and it's deeply rooted in my own experiences, like all going all the way back to youth, right up to this very moment that we're speaking. There's nothing more important than finding a way to participate in engaged compassion. Nothing. To me, it's the key to is not only being able to see and identify the need of engaged compassionate activities, but to find and understand suffering's causes and methods that exist to end it. Doing anything like that is something that all of us on the planet can engage in, and it's accessible to us. It's not for the 1% wealthy, or for it is challenging in terms of accessibility to the vast majority of underprivileged people on the planet, but it is available to them if they can hear, if they can speak, if there's those that are willing to be out there and engage with them. It can be available to them. It can be brought to them. And again, as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be in the form of a big program or project. Those are fine. If that's within your reach, go for it. Don't miss the opportunity. Life's too short. But it could be in day-to-day, with your family. Geshe Darge, one of my other teachers, just finished a course at DNKL, an 8-week course. And I didn't attend it. It's on compassion, but I didn't attend it. But one of his students I was talking to the other day, and she said to me, like, he made it so like you're missing the point if you don't live it in your own house. He said, like, you're wasting your time taking this course unless you're being compassionate to the person you live with. I'm looking over here as if there's nobody over here, but I'm in my house. So, and if you can't do that, that's where it's got to start. So it's available to all of us. We just have to go for it. And the way to do that is to find some kind of a program or system or path that one can engage with, so that you can develop the inner qualities that then become the spark plug. They become the spark plug for having that natural arising experience of like, I've got to do this. I've got to get engaged. I have to be part of the solution. Geshe Darge also said, and recently, in the conversation he and myself and a few other people were having with him, he said, if everyone in the world participated in engaged compassion, motivated by knowing what causes suffering, and that there's actually a path to end suffering. He said, if everyone would do that, he said, within moments, not months, not years, 80% of the world's suffering would end instantly. And then he added on and said, it wouldn't take much longer for the other 20% to end too. What could be more important than that in the world? So I think all this, my whole ramble here on this question goes to underscore how and why I feel engaged compassion is what I said. There's nothing more important, but it does have to be built on some knowledge that comes from certain kinds of practices that inform you about how life really works, and that one can engage in a path to really end suffering in that world that is really filled with lots of suffering. Otherwise, it could become, engaged compassion could become very frustrating. It could feel like you're beating your head against the wall. So I'm a firm believer in knowledge and action working together. They're the ultimate, another one of my teachers from years ago would say the two wings of practice, So practice what? Helping people, and animals and all sentient beings, right? So, I think that's pretty hard to argue with. So, we could have millions and billions of dollars and have foundations and create really big projects. But if each one of us, like Geshe Darge said recently, would just, we're empowered as individuals, we're engaged compassion could become like the most important thing we do with our lives before we leave this planet. Enough said.
I agree 100%. Because if you look at most human-made suffering, behind it, it's an afflicted mind, where there's too much self-focus and not enough awareness of what the community needs. And if you look at the goodness in the world, it's usually someone who's cultivated their heart and their intellect, and they're giving back to their family and the people around them, and they create a happy community, And so,
Yeah.
so the last question, would you be willing to lead a brief contemplation on engaged compassion?
Sure. I'm going to make it real simple. It's a 6-step contemplation that's real accessible. There are so many meditation practices, Wilson, that, bring forth what I was talking about a moment ago, that inner motivation for one to participate in engaged compassion, like where, you just have to jump out of the seat and get to it. You just can't wait another moment. But, with the short time we have available to us today, I would just simply ask for one to sit quietly and relax your mind. And in that state, just simply contemplate the following 6 steps. The 6 steps are thoughts, 6 thoughts. Then the first thought is an affirmation of sorts. All people, including myself, want to be happy. All people, including myself, want to be happy. And once affirming that, the second thought, if I knew the source of all suffering, and further, that there is a path to end suffering, wouldn't I take it? If I knew the source of all suffering and that there's a path to end suffering, wouldn't I take it? And hopefully, if one is able to affirm a positive answer to that question. One could take the further thought. If that path provides me with the opportunity to end not only my suffering, but all others too, wouldn't I make that my focus? Meaning, ending all others' suffering. Wouldn't I make that my focus? Assuming one affirms that with a positive response, one has the next thought, taking on the motivation of this opportunity to end suffering for oneself and all others. Take this path. That means taking time to discover what it truly is and the tools that makes it available for one to successfully travel this path. So affirming with this thought that one will take this path, it starts with finding that truth, that reality. Otherwise, how would we use these tools? How would we engage in compassionate activities? We need these tools. And the fifth thought, as you do this engagement, look around you. Find ways to aid those in your life by applying what you've learned on the path. Applying tools and techniques they afford you to help others. What a gift. And the last thought, number 6. Do not waste the opportunity. We only have a short time. We are here in this precious human life. Very short time. So engage in compassionate activities to benefit others. It is the true path to your own happiness and all others. So that's my 6-step thought piece for today, Wilson.
John, I can't thank you enough.
My pleasure.
Deep gratitude, my friend.